Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
So, Melanie, this news just coming into our newsroom, further showing that the conflict with Israel and Hamas continues bright and early this Tuesday morning. I would first like to discuss, if you don't mind, the humanitarian crisis. We know several tent encampments out in Gaza have been deemed safe by Israeli Defense Forces, but we're learning that not really any area is safe. The airstrikes don't have an address. They land where they do, as the IDF does continue to try to defeat Hamas. Could you provide some perspective on this breaking news, please?
Yes, we know there was a strike. We don't know what the casualty total is. We know that the Hamas regularly inflate the casualty totals. It may well be that innocent civilians were caught up in this. Israel says it targeted a number of specific terrorists. It has actually named them and named the people that it says it has killed. And it says that it took care to take a great deal of care before launching its strike to make sure as far as possible that civilians weren't in the way. It's perfectly possible that they were. As you say, this is a designated humanitarian area. The reason why Israel is forced to go into these areas in this way is very, very regrettable, to put it mildly. But the reason is that the Hamas persist in using these designated humanitarian areas deliberately to put the infrastructure of their terrorist activities there, the people, the weapons, and so on, deliberately in order to use the civilians who have specifically been moved there by Israel in a humanitarian enterprise to remove them from the field of battle. Hamas put them there deliberately in order that they should be killed, in order that the Western media should be reporting this as the way that it will undoubtedly do, most of the Western media, as Israel behaving inhumanely in targeting a humanitarian area. And in this, the Hamas has laid a trap for Israel. Israel has no option but to move in this way in certain circumstances. I believe it takes as much care as it possibly can, much more care than any other army in the history of battle takes care, but nevertheless, there will be civilian casualties. But we have to be absolutely clear that the people who have caused these civilians to be killed are the Hamas.
Melanie, thank you so much for that perspective. And we know the conflict with Hamas is not the only conflict at this hour. Israel also has a looming conflict with Hezbollah, also those Yemen Houthi rebels. There are concerns this morning regarding the Biden administration and the response. Could you share those updates, please?
Yes, I think not many people outside Israel fully understand what's actually going on here in Israel. It's not simply a war in Gaza. It is not simply a war against the Hamas in Gaza. It is not even simply a war against the Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. This is a 7 or 8 front war by Iran directed at the eradication of Israel, the destruction of Israel, the mass slaughter of Israelis and Jews as a prelude to a full-on war against the West. Now, it's not a looming battle with the Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. People, again, in the West may not realize, but every day since the October 7 atrocity in Gaza, Hezbollah have been unleashing dozens and dozens of rockets, missiles, other weaponry, drones at northern Israel, causing around 80,000 Israelis, who are the inhabitants of northern Israel, to become effectively refugees in their own country. They have been displaced from their homes for 11 months. This attrition, this war of attrition by the Hezbollah is increasing in intensity and in depth. And Israel is of the view that it cannot go on like this. The people of Israel are absolutely certain it cannot go on like this. They are demanding that the Israeli government, that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, finish this in Lebanon once and for all. Now, some voices in the Biden administration have let it be known in an unsourced, anonymous kind of way that they absolutely understand Israel's position and they agree that Israel has to do something definitive. Other voices in the Biden administration are saying, no, 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 no. If Israel really does go to war properly in southern Lebanon to get rid of the Hezbollah once and for all. It's not going to work. It's not going to succeed. The only way through this is through diplomatic negotiations. Well, I'm afraid Israelis have been through this before. There was a diplomatic negotiation many years ago to stop the Hezbollah. It resulted in what was the UN Security Council resolution, which required the Hezbollah to withdraw from behind the Litani River. And a UN force was put in to enforce that. This has not happened. Hezbollah have cited, under the eye of the UN forces, despite this resolution, Hezbollah have cited, we don't know how many, upwards of 250,000 missiles, rockets, and other weaponry among the civilian population of southern Lebanon. They have dug very sophisticated tunnels from within southern Lebanon towards Israel. They are a formidable force. They are a professional fighting force, a professional army. They make the Hamas look like rank amateurs. No one in Israel is under any illusions that if Israel goes to war properly against the Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, this is incredibly dangerous for Israel. Israel may find that it, as a result, Hezbollah unleash their rocketry. We may find that Iran directly unleashes. Most of the civilian population of southern Lebanon has been removed. A long time ago, they moved. The civilians who are likely to be suffering as a result of an all-out war by Israel against the Hezbollah are the Israelis. Such is the desperation of Israel in this pincer movement, this 8-front pincer movement by Iran, and specifically in respect of the shrinkage of Israel because of the necessary evacuation of its people from northern Israel. They cannot go back, even if Hezbollah said, okay, ceasefire. Northern Israelis cannot go back to their homes knowing that there are tunnels, just like they were in Gaza, just a few meters from their homes, knowing that still 250,000 rockets or whatever it is are waiting for them. This has to be finished once and for all. And people who assume that this can be dealt with by negotiation, I'm afraid, have a very short memory of the history of this, and I'm afraid a very poor understanding of precisely what's at stake here in Israel.
Melanie, so many great points you're making this morning. Something that we wanted to dig a little deeper in, if you don't mind, you mentioned the historical aspect of this. You mentioned Hezbollah, and I know you said, there isn't this looming conflict that people would think, but I want to ask you, if we go back before October 7th, some in that area were saying there was conflict with Hezbollah, but that October 7th kind of added fuel to the fire, if you will. Would you say that's what you're seeing on your end, or that's what you're hearing, or it's just in different regions? There are different news reports and different outlooks on the situation?
Well, there are certainly different outlooks, and I would say that most of the outlooks in the Western media, Fox apart, of course, are wrong. They're too narrowly focused. This has always been a war by Iran through its proxies against Israel. It's used its proxies, first of all, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and increasingly, unfortunately, we're seeing also in what's called the West Bank, the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria, which is really among the heartlands of Israel. We're seeing Iran ramping up its war there as we speak. So that's another front that has to be dealt with. So there are all these fronts going on. But the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, or rather the war mounted by Iran through Hezbollah against Israel from southern Lebanon, has been going on for a very long time. It's been going on for years and years, and Israel has never managed to end it because the international community has always stepped in to stop Israel from ending it. I'm afraid to say that the international community, led by America in particular, Israel is very grateful for the support that America has shown over the years. But it's a kind of two-edged sword because America, especially as far as the current administration is concerned, America seems to be, on the one hand, very sure that it must do everything it can to prevent Israel from being annihilated. So it will come to Israel's defense. We know that there is a large force assembled in the waters around Israel of American warships and so on. and that is to defend Israel. But at the same time, the Biden administration in particular has been really, since October 7, been doing everything it can to prevent Israel from definitively winning a victory, from definitively defeating Hamas once and for all, and has warned Israel over and over again, right from the start, do not try to finish this with Hezbollah, because we in America and the West are frightened that this may lead to a regional war, it may lead to Iran unleashing. Well, the fact is that because of the fact that Israel was prevented from dealing a definitive blow against Hezbollah really right after October 7, there is a regional war. It's being waged on 8 fronts. It involves the Houthis of Yemen, for goodness sake. It involves Iraq. It is now involving Jordan. It is a regional war, and it's the old story that if you try to appease genocidal fanatics who cannot be appeased, you end up not avoiding war. You end up with a really terrible war, a far worse war than you would have had you taken effective, stern measures to begin with. And not only is it a more terrible war that you are almost certainly inviting, but it's a war in which the cards are stacked against the people who are on the right side. The cards are stacked in favor of the aggressor. And that's what we've seen over many, many years. The international community has said to Israel, negotiation is the way to proceed. But I'm afraid when you're negotiating with fanatics, there is no negotiation. You have to defeat them. And this is a lesson that America and the West really don't want to learn. They don't really want to understand or acknowledge what it is to fight a religious war, to fight religious fanatics who believe they are doing the work of God himself, against which there is no negotiation possible. They see negotiation by the West as a sign of incipient surrender, as evidence of weakness that they can then exploit. And they do exploit the negotiation. We've seen with the ceasefire negotiations going on with the Hamas. They are not going on with the Hamas. This is an illusion. They are going on with Hamas's representatives, with Egypt, with Qatar, with America. But they're actually not going on with Hamas. Hamas have made it very clear. There is to be no negotiating position other than the surrender of Israel. They've made that clear for the last 11 months. And because Israel has been really forced by America to go down this negotiation road on the very understandable hope by the population that this may free the hostages, this was always an illusion. The hostages have been taken for one reason only, and that is to secure Israel's total, unmitigated surrender. And Hamas never had any intention of releasing those hostages unless that was the case, that Israel would surrender. They gave up some of those hostages back in whenever it was with a ceasefire negotiation, but that was because at that time Israel had achieved a military advantage such that Hamas was in great difficulty. But since then, Israel's hands have been increasingly tied, principally by America and Western public opinion, which has been inflamed by what we started talking about, which is the apparent disregard of human life, civilian human life in Gaza by the Israelis. That perception is entirely untrue. The very opposite is the case. Israel has gone to unprecedented lengths, unknown in the history of warfare, to protect human life, civilian life in Gaza as far as they can. But the Hamas, and this is an Iranian strategy, is to accelerate and accentuate and increase the number of civilian casualties, precisely so the Western media can paint Israel in the worst possible light. Because I'm afraid to say that the Western public, the gullible Western media and the gullible Western public who are playing Hamas's game for it to the letter, it is the Western media that is Hamas's greatest weapon in its desire to exterminate the state of Israel.
Melanie Philips, truly a pleasure speaking with you this Tuesday morning. Thank you so much for your candidness and your perspective on this topic. You mentioned the West, and right here in the U.S., we are anticipating the first presidential debate between VP Harris and former President Donald Trump. And as you are fully aware, the Israel Hamas war and conflict in the Middle East has been highly politicized. Right here in the U.S., the Biden administration saying that Trump would not have handled it properly, and former President Trump saying that he thinks the Biden-Harris administration is doing horribly with handling it. And I'd love to know your thoughts about that before we let you go. Again, right there in Israel, a lot of people upset with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's handling of the war as well.
Indeed. Netanyahu is, like President Trump, a deeply divisive figure. And a lot of people who once supported Netanyahu through thick and thin no longer do so. But I think, again, what people in the West don't really understand, and I think actually quite a lot of Israelis don't really understand, there is a difference between Netanyahu as a divisive political figure and Netanyahu as the war leader. As a divisive figure, as a politician, one can totally believe that he is an awful person, that he has severe character flaws, that he is really out for himself. He wants to stay in power, and that he is ruthless in that regard. That he doesn't tell the truth. That he concentrates power in himself. All these things. It's possible to think all those things and yet at the same time acknowledge that in the prosecution of the war, he is acting in accordance with the wishes of the vast majority of people. So people here in Israel, they want two things. They want Hamas to be completely destroyed as a military force forever. They are no longer content with what successive administrations, including those run by Mr. Netanyahu, have done hitherto, which is what's called mowing the lawn. They occasionally go to war in Gaza, they defeat Hamas, they inflict serious damage on Hamas, and then Hamas basically reorganizes, regroups, and the rockets start again. People have had enough of that. They don't want that. They want Hamas to be completely destroyed, and they want the war to continue until that happens. At the same time, they want the hostages returned safe and sound. Now, I believe that Mr. Netanyahu is doing everything he can to achieve that eventuality, that the hostages should be returned. The idea that he doesn't want the hostages to be returned because he is only out for himself, he's only out for the continuation of his rather precarious coalition, which depends on some rather extremist characters. Even if that were true, even if, he was completely consumed by personal ambition, even if it were true that he had no concern whatsoever for any of these hostages, and he had no concern for the fact these are Israeli lives which are being lost in the most appalling conditions in the tunnels run by Hamas, even if that were true, it doesn't make any sense that if he was such a consummate politician, that he would embark upon a course of action deliberately, not to get the hostages back, knowing that would be the most terrible thing for the population, for his electorate. It doesn't make sense by any definition. So I believe he is doing whatever he can, but the IDF are in an impossible position. There are hundreds of miles of tunnels under Gaza. The hostages could have been and could be anywhere. First of all, they can't find them. And even if they have been able to locate them, they're hostages for a good reason. They will be killed, as we saw tragically just a few days ago when the 6 hostages were murdered by the Hamas in the tunnel where they were being kept, apparently when the Hamas realized that the Israel Defense Forces were nearby. Now, this is an impossible dilemma. And people who say, that the reason he hasn't returned the hostages is because he simply wants the coalition to continue and therefore he's not prepared to have a ceasefire. There are so many misapprehensions in this It hasn't been possible to rescue the hostages. That's the sort of bottom line. And the ceasefire wouldn't return them either, because there's no guarantee that any of them would actually be returned. And the ceasefire is not just a kind of nice little ceasefire and then the hostages come back. The ceasefire requirements by Hamas are nothing less than the total surrender of Israel. That means the continuation of Hamas as a military force that can again and again and again, as they have threatened to do precisely what they did on October the 7th, to invade Israel, to butcher its people, to keep the rockets going. That's what a ceasefire would mean. Now, one can fully understand the emotion in Israel over this. There is nothing more terrible than for these last 11 months to know that first of all, was it 250? Now it's something like 100 hostages that are still there. We don't know how many are alive. But those who are alive, we know are being kept in the most appalling conditions. It is tearing Israelis apart, the idea of what's happening to those hostages. And one can understand absolutely the passion of the hostage families, some of whom have blamed Netanyahu in the most dramatic and emotional way. And one can understand why they think this, because I think none of us has the right to really criticize any of those families for anything they're saying. Having said that, there are other actors in Israel who are highly political, whose agenda has been for a very long time to lever Netanyahu out of office by one way or the other. And wickedly, in my view, those political actors have unscrupulously weaponized the desperate situation of the hostages and the appalling and unthinkable agony of their families in order to hurt Netanyahu. Now, that's all going on here in Israel. This is a very complicated business. It is not easy to describe because every way you look at this is awful. Every alternative is awful. It's simply a question of what is the most awful thing. And this is the kind of dilemma that the Israelis are up against. This is the kind of dilemma that Netanyahu is up against. And as I said at the beginning, you don't have to like Netanyahu. You can really loathe and despise the man. But fair-minded people would look at the situation as it stands and say, no prime minister of Israel could have done any other than he has been doing. Unfortunately, fair-mindedness, as you know, in America is a virtue that tends to be in short supply in our very divided and polarized times, which is extremely unfortunate because reality, truth, facts tend to get swept away under all this emotion. But I do think it's very important to have this sense of perspective. And it's a very great shame that the Western media in general is not providing it for the Western public.
Well, Melanie Philips, thank you again for your candidness and your passion on this topic this Tuesday morning. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.